Hey, how's it going, everyone? In this video, I am going to be attempting a 100 days CSS challenge. So there's this really cool website, if you haven't heard of it, it's called 100dayscss.com. And the idea is that there's 100 of these little CSS challenges, and every day they prompt you with a new one. So today's challenge is this little collection of squares, and then they kind of rotate around and form into circles. So I just kind of loaded this up today because I wanted to do a CSS video, and I thought this would be a really good one to kind of step through. So if you're just starting off with CSS, or if you're just kind of getting into web development, you might look at something like this and be like, how would I even attempt to build this? Like, how would I even go about making this happen? So what I want to do is walk through step by step exactly how we would build something like this. And I'll give you an idea of some of the techniques and some of the CSS properties that we would use. So once again, the website is 100dayscss.com. And if you go to this website, it might be like a different challenge, but today we're just going to be attempting this one. So there is a template that you can use. If you just click open template over here, that's what we're going to use. It's just kind of like formatted out for us. So you can see here with this template, they kind of just have this little box here. So what we're going to do is we'll build this thing inside of that box, and we'll walk through all the techniques and strategies that we would use. Cool. So just to kind of get familiar with this template, now we have this little frame class and this little center class. You don't need to worry about that. We're not going to touch these at all. But you'll see up here in the HTML that we do have stuff in here. So, I could create a div. I could put hello world in here, and then that's going to kind of show up in the center. Perfect. So it looks like that's all wired up and working. So now what I want to do is talk through how we would start building this. Now, if we take a look on here, you'll see that really what we have is a bunch of these squares, and then they kind of animate themselves, right? So we have a square, and it kind of rotates, I don't know, it looks like maybe 180 degrees, something like that, maybe 360 degrees. So we have these squares, they rotate, and they almost transform themselves into ovals. So you can see here they start as squares, but then at the end of this animation, they're these kind of oval shaped things. So that's kind of what we want to do. Now, the first step is, I think we just want to build out one of these squares. So I'm going to create a div in here, and then inside of here, I'll create another div. And let me type this out correctly. And I want to give this div a class of square. So this is going to have a class of square, and I want to show you how we can build out the square and then how we could build out that animation as well. So inside of this center, we just have a div and then our class square div. So down here in my CSS, I want to start styling this. So dot square, we want to just give this a width and a height, and then we're also going to give it a border, because that's basically what these elements are. They're just squares that have a border on them. So let's give it a width, and maybe we can do 10 REMs, something like that. Height would be 10 REMs. So with REMs, if the font size is 16 pixels, which it normally is, that means this will be 10 times that size, so 160 pixels. And then also we want to give this a border, so the border can be 1 pixel solid black. Okay, so now what we should have, and that's exactly what we have right here, is this nice square, and it's sort of rendered out there in the center. Now, that's what we start with over here. Now, obviously, we have more of these squares, and I'm going to talk about how we can kind of generalize this code out to handle multiple squares. But first, I want to show you how we can animate this. So the animation that's happening is twofold. One, the square is rotating. Another, the square is actually changing from a square into an oval. So there's these two things that we need to account for. Now, generally, when we're doing animations in CSS, specifically where we want to change multiple properties, we're going to use what are called keyframes. So keyframes is a special way that you can animate something in CSS, and you can basically define an animation, and then it'll be applied to one of these elements. So you just say keyframes like this over here, and then we want to give this a name. Now, I'm just going to give this a name of, why don't we just call this A0 for now? So this will stand for animation 0. And eventually we're going to have a bunch of these different keyframes. So that's why I'm kind of naming them with these numbers. But yeah, we're just going to call this A0 for now. Now let's take a look at this animation. You'll see that the animation starts off where it's just a square. And then halfway through the animation, it's transformed into an oval and it's rotated. And then it sort of rotates back and turns back into a square. So it starts as a square. In the middle, it's an oval and it's rotated, and then at the end, it's a square again. So with these keyframes, there's a bunch of different ways that you can kind of encode these, but one of the most useful is using percentages. So I could say 50% just like that. And this means that whatever I put in here, so whatever I put inside of these curly brackets, that's gonna be the CSS styling when we're 50% of the way through the animation. And so 50% of the way through the animation here, I want this to be rotated, and I also want it to be an oval. So why don't we start with rotate? Over here, I'm just gonna say transform, and I'm gonna say rotate, and why don't we just rotate this 180 degrees? So this is how I could theoretically rotate this box. Now let me show you what happens. So we created our keyframe over here. What I wanna do is I wanna attach that animation to this square. And the way that we do that is using the animation property. So here we can say animation name, and the name is just gonna be A0. We can also say animation duration, and in this case, maybe this can be like 3 seconds. So this is gonna be how long it takes for this animation to complete. And then finally over here, I wanna say animation iteration count, and I'm gonna say infinite. And this basically means that this will just animate infinitely. So it'll just go through this animation like nonstop. And you can see when we add on these properties, then this thing starts animating. And so this is pretty useful, right? It's kind of animating around, it's spinning around, and that's what's happening here. So 50% of the way through this animation, it's rotated 180 degrees. So we have the rotation down, that's good. It's rotating and then it's rotating back. Another thing that we want to do though is we want to turn it into basically like an oval. So the way we could turn this into an oval is we could just change the height property. Now I guess you could change height or width, it doesn't really matter. By default, these are 10 REMs. So we could change this to, I don't know, maybe like 5 REMs. I guess that would kind of be an oval. So let's see what happens now. So you can see 50% of the way through the animation, it's kind of slimmed down a bit, and then it comes back out as a full square. And then finally, if we want to make this an oval, we can change the border radius property, and we're going to make this 50%. So the 50% there, what that's going to do is it'll basically just turn it into an oval. So you can see now we're getting kind of an oval right there. Now I think I might want this to be a little bit smaller, so why don't we change this to 2.5 REMs. So this will be kind of like I guess a thinner oval. Yeah, so that's looking good right there. Okay, so we have the basic animation down for these keyframes. And this is like the first big step that we need to get past. So that's essentially what's happening here. Now, I don't know the exact like values that they're using for all this stuff, but you can see that it's looking pretty similar, right? So the animation itself, we are rotating and we're changing size. Now, if we wanted to, we can make this like 360. I don't know if it's making a full rotation or not. Yeah, that's a little fast. So maybe we could turn this, we'll just keep it at 180 for now. You can play around with all these values, right? It doesn't really matter, but this is just kind of like how something like this could be built. Okay, but now the question becomes, how do we add additional squares? So you can see here that we have all of these different squares and they're all kind of animating together. So I want to show you how we can do this. Now, this is a situation where JavaScript would actually help us out a lot. Now, this isn't a JavaScript tutorial, so I'm not going to be doing any JavaScript. Maybe at the end, I might show you how we could make this a little bit easier with JavaScript. But if you want to do this in pure CSS, there is a pretty easy way to do that. And let me show you how that works. So we're going to need to now, instead of working with one square, we're going to need to work with multiple squares. So let's see how we might be able to do this with 2 squares right off the bat. Now, the first thing that you'll notice is when I have 2 of these squares rendered out here, they're actually rendered side by side, or actually on top of one another. And the reason that they're rendered that way is because both of these elements by default have something called static positioning. And static positioning just means that they're going to align themselves the same way that they're aligned over here in the HTML. So the square, this one is on top of this one, so that's how they kind of align themselves over there. What we want to do is we want to change these so that they're no longer static positioning. So I want to come over here to the square, and instead of making it static, I want to make it absolute. So we can say position, and you're going to give this a position of absolute. And what this will do is it'll make it so that they no longer like sort of align themselves where it's like one over the other. Now they're going to align themselves on top of one another. Okay, so now you can see that instead of having those two squares that are just lined up one on top of the other, now it almost looks like we only have one square. In reality, though, we have a couple of different squares here. They're just lined up exactly on top of each other, so we can't tell the difference. Now, the reason that we give this absolute positioning is because when we give this absolute positioning, it will make it so that these elements don't take up any space theoretically in the document, and that's why that's useful. And then you can see over here with this center thing, this also has position absolute, so that means that these will center, or they'll position themselves relative to this center. Now you'll see that they're not exactly in the center, and this kind of has to do with the way that this like center class is set up. I'm not a big fan of how they did this here. They're like using this translate thing. We could play around with these values a little bit. So if you change these, then we could kind of like, I guess, center these differently. I'll show you another way that we can center these later on, but for now, let's just change these so it kind of looks like it's a little bit more in the center. Okay, so that's looking like a little bit better. Now here's the thing. We have two of these squares. Both squares are using this square class, which means both of them have this animation name as A0. Here's what we want to do though. If you look at this animation over here, essentially what's happening here is that like all of these boxes are rotating a different number of degrees. So the first box is rotating 180 degrees maybe, the second one is rotating 170 and then 160. So really, instead of all of these squares rotating 180, I want the first one to rotate 180, I want the second one to rotate 170, and so on until we're able to form like this big circle. Now, what we want to do is we want to essentially change the animation depending on which one of these divs we're looking at. So I'm going to actually give these IDs, and I'm going to call this one like S1. So that's just going to stand for, or why don't we call this S0? That'll stand for like, the first square that we have. And then let's call this one S1. So let me show you how this might work. So now we have these two squares. They each have these IDs like S0 versus S1. And what I'd like to do now is actually start styling these. So we can create another keyframe, and I'm going to call this one A1. And instead of rotating 180 degrees, this one is going to rotate 160 degrees. So it'll rotate like a little bit less than this guy up here. Now, instead of giving all of the squares this same A0 animation, instead I want to give S0 animation name A0, and then I want to give S1, which is that next one, animation A1. And so now you can see that we have both of these which are styled. So you can see down here we have both of these squares, but they're rotating a different amount. So square S0, which is this guy up here, square S0 has the animation name of A0, square S1 has the animation name of A1, and those are both rotating a different number of degrees. So this is essentially like what we want to do here. So I can kind of group these together even. And so for each one of these squares up here, we'll give it its own animation, which will rotate it a different number of degrees. Now, we're obviously like repeating a lot of code here. And if you wanted to like not repeat code, that's where you'd have to use JavaScript. So we could use JavaScript to kind of prevent ourselves from having to repeat all of this. But if we're just doing this in straight up CSS, this is the way to do it. So let's go ahead and create some more of these squares. Why don't we make, I don't know, 5 or 6 of these, and then we'll kind of see how it looks. So we'll have S2, S3, and S4. So I'm just going to copy this whole thing, and then we'll kind of change the numbers for each. So now this will be S2, it'll be A2, this will be called A2, and then we'll rotate 140 degrees. So we're just kind of like going by 20-degree increments. So this will be S3, A3, A3, and then this is going to be 120. And then we'll do the same thing for S4. So obviously this is a little bit tedious, but this is what we're going to have to do. So this will be 100. And then we have our last one, which is going to be 80. And then this is going to be S5. Okay, perfect. So now we have all of these kind of encoded in and added up, and you can see that they're creating kind of like a circle. Now, if we change these degree values, we could change like, you know, if this looks more like a circle or not. And obviously adding more of these in is also going to make this look like a circle. So what I'll do is I'm going to add in a bunch more of these. I'll kind of edit this part out, and then we'll see how this looks once we have more of these going on. Okay, so I just went off screen for a second, and just so you didn't have to sit through me doing all of this, but I added all the way up to S9. So we started from A0 and S0, which were these guys over here. Now, we started off at 180 degrees, and then I basically just, for each next one, I subtracted 20 degrees. And then we went all the way down till we get to 0 degrees, which is here for A9. And actually, I don't even know if we would need this S9. I think I could probably just remove that. Because either way, I don't know that we would even want it to not rotate at all. So maybe we can come down here to S8. So you can see here that now we have, an animation that is very similar to the one that's over here, right? So this one it definitely has more of these squares. So if you want to go ahead and add in more of these squares, and then you could also, instead of incrementing by 20 or decrementing, you could decrement by 10. That might give you a kind of structure that looks kind of similar, but really this is the technique that we would want to use. So this is the technique that would allow us to kind of build this out, and you can see that the animation is looking nice. And so you can play around with the degree values, you can play around with how many squares you actually want to have in here, but depending on how you do that, it'll look a little bit different. Now, essentially that wraps it up. So this is kind of all the core concepts that you would need in order to build something like that. And like I said, we're obviously repeating ourselves a lot. We could simplify this a little bit with JavaScript. Specifically, we could automatically generate all of these HTML elements, and then we could also automatically generate these. We could automatically add in the animation name. It's not something that I think needs to be gone over right now. But yeah, this is basically exactly how you would build something like this. Now there is a little bit of funkiness here. You'll notice that it almost looks like this square thing is kind of like, I don't know, it looks like it's like moving upwards when it animates. Like this guy over here, it's kind of like staying in the same plane, whereas this one over here, it's not really doing that. It's kind of like moving up, right? This seems like the center of the square, and yet up here is where the center of that circle goes. So I'll show you how we can fix that. And I think one thing you could do is just play around with these guys over here. Like I said, I'm not a huge fan of this stuff where we're kind of transforming all of this, even with this frame. So I'm actually just gonna change, I guess, some of the styling on this, and we'll kind of clean it up a little bit. So I'm gonna create a div over here, and this is just gonna be kind of like a wrapper div. And I'll show you how we can center this using Flexbox, which is probably how this should be centered. So this is going to have a class of wrapper, and then I'm going to put all of this stuff in here. So we're creating this new div, and this new div has a class of wrapper. Perfect. Now what we're going to do is style the wrapper. So here I'm going to come down and give this wrapper some styling. So this is going to be height. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this the height of basically the window over here. So we could say 100 VH, and that just means 100 viewport height. So this will now be 100% of the height of this entire document. Now in here in this frame, you can see where it has this position absolute, top 50%, left 50%. This isn't really a good way to style things like this, just because 50%, they're trying to center this thing, but it's just not really a good way to do it. So we can leave the width and the height. I'm going to get rid of that stuff. We can get rid of all this margin stuff. We'll keep the border radius, keep the box shadow, overflow hidden, that's fine. Background's good, color's good. So all of this stuff is looking good. And then all we have to do to center this is we can just say display flex up here on the wrapper, justify content, center, and then align items, center. So when we center things using Flexbox, we don't have to use those percentages and all sorts of stuff like that. We can just do it this way. And looks like I have a little typo here on this display flex. But now you'll see that this should be centered here on the page, and it's centered using Flexbox, which means it's kind of just I guess it's just a better way to center things. And so then down here in this center thing, we actually can completely get rid of this because now we are styling this the right way. And so I'll get rid of this center div up here. And then over here in the frame, I'm also going to give this display flex. And then I'm also going to give this down here, justify content center and align items center. And then the last thing that we need to do in order to get this to work is you can see here that we have this kind of like wrapper div. So we're just going to get rid of that. And so now all we need is the wrapper, the frame, and then all of these squares. And now you'll see that these are nicely centered in here. And we no longer have that problem where like the animation is going up. So really the main problem there was just the way that this frame and that dot center class were kind of rendered out. This is definitely, I think, a better way to do this using this flexbox. And you can see now that it's kind of like looking pretty perfect. Okay, so that's really it. Like that's everything that we needed in order to build this. Like I said, you can increase the number of squares, and then you can also, if you want, just add them in down here, like add in extra keyframes, and then, you know, just kind of customize this. But this is all basically this is the technique that we would use for building this out. Perfect. All right, so I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed building out a little CSS animation. If you want as well, you can add yours here, so you can see that a lot of people kind of add their stuff in down here, and they have kind of different variations and all that stuff. So now that you know the main techniques, you can go in, you can add different colors and, you know, do all sorts of different stuff with that. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you have any questions, leave a comment. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.